Welcome to What the Paper Said, in which I, Patrick Crozier, skim through the Times from 100 years ago, read some of the articles and comment on the ones I find interesting. In this episode, the week ending the 22nd of April 1923, the Prime Minister is not unwell, a man is found with a gun, and in Oxford it studies against understudies. We begin with a correction. Last week I gave the impression that white lead in paint had been banned in the 1920s. It turns out I was incorrect. It wasn't banned until the 1970s, at least in Britain. And now the headlines. The big story this week has been the budget delivered by the Chancellor of the Exchequer, Stanley Baldwin. The main features are that the UK government is currently running a surplus and that income tax is being reduced. There's also a proposal for a tax on betting, which is generating quite a lot of correspondence in the pages of the Times. In the Soviet Union, they are putting Patriarch Tikhon on trial, another sort of part of their war on religion. In other news, in the courts there has been a case which has revolved around the meaning of the phrase domestic servant. What has happened is a very rich man in his will has given a lot of money to his domestic servants. And now the chauffeur and gardener and one other, whose role I forget, have said, well, what about us? Do we count? And the answer, it turns out, due to precedent, is no. No, they don't. In India, there has been some rioting in Amritsar. Now, all I know about Amritsar was the massacre which took place in 1919, and that involved native Indians and British troops. Well, on this occasion, it doesn't involve British troops. It's trouble between Hindus and Muslims. A few episodes ago, I mentioned the issue with homemade wirelesses. Now, when the British Broadcasting Company was set up, it was funded partly from the license fee and partly by the manufacturers of sets. And the deal was that only manufacturers who are members of the British Broadcasting Company could sell wireless sets. And of course, a homemade set is bound to fall foul of those rules. Anyway, there's some toing and froing about whether homemade sets can be licensed. On the 28th of January episode, I mentioned the case of the Whitgift Hospital. Now, this is an ancient building in Croydon. Now, the local government want to ease congestion by widening a road. Unfortunately, the Whitgift Hospital gets in the way, so they want to demolish it. They've gone to the trouble of holding a local referendum, and the good burghers of Croydon have decided that they, given a choice, they'd rather have a wider road than a Whitgift Hospital. Anyway, this has now reached the Lords, and in a debate which involved a former Foreign Secretary, the Archbishop of Canterbury and Lord Montague of Bewley, he with motor cars, the Lords has decided that they don't like this idea very much and have rejected Croydon's proposals. On Wednesday, the Times published some statistics on the subject of people who were killed by falling from trains. And the average is about 30 a year. Now, it has to be said in those days they didn't have electric doors. But even so, this is a bit of a surprise. Also on Wednesday, the Times reviewed a new play called Merton the Movies. Now, the play itself is not very important, but the reviewer's first line was interesting, shall we say. He said, "This, like many another American importation, is extraordinarily crude," an attitude that sadly lasts to this day. Also on Wednesday came the news that Hitler had been charged by the Supreme Court of Germany with insulting government ministers. This has caused a lot of trouble for the Bavarian government. The Bavarian government jealously guards its independence and only very reluctantly submitted to the Supreme Court's jurisdiction. You would have thought it was pretty obvious if you want to be part of Germany, well, you have to be part of its legal system. But hey-ho. The problem for them is, of course, that Hitler has a lot of stormtroopers, a lot of people who are prepared to defend him, and if they try to arrest him, then there's going to be a fight. This was illustrated a bit further down the same column by a report of an article in a communist publication. Yeah, communist publication. Yeah, could be Pacalized, but I suspect they're telling the truth on this occasion. Anyway, what they said was that a bunch of stormtroopers had been on exercises, but they had been on exercises with a detachment from the German army, which says a lot about the position of, well, first of all, the links between the Nazis and the German army, and also the weakness of the German army, in that I'm sure it would rather just be doing exercises on its own, but it doesn't have the manpower. There was also a report about a experiment carried out in France involving a pilotless flight, or as we might know it, a drone. They did say in the article that it might be used for military purposes. Indeed it might. On Thursday there was an article entitled Healthiest Winter. When I read it, I thought that might be about fog, or when I read the higher headline, I thought it might be about fog or smog, but it turns out it wasn't. It was actually about the decline in flu. Now, I thought the flu outbreak, I mean, obviously we've all heard of, well, most of us have heard of the Spanish flu, which arrived in Europe in 1918 and killed huge numbers of people. But apparently it was still going on in the winter of 1921-22, but it has completely disappeared in the winter that's just gone by. So a bit of good news. On Monday, the Times published an article by its parliamentary correspondent. This is what he had to say. Some of the Sunday newspapers endeavoured to discover a new political sensation yesterday by announcing that the premiership would be vacant at no distant date, owing to the forthcoming retirement of Mr. Bonar in view of the present state of his health. I am authorised by the Prime Minister to state that he has no intention whatever of laying down the high office he holds. Does he not? It may be mentioned that Mr. Bonar, who spent the weekend in London, was playing lawn tennis on Saturday and again yesterday afternoon. And lawn tennis is hardly the recreation of a sick man. I could say something about the absurdity of all this, but the truth is he's dying, and I think you're allowed a little bit of leeway under those circumstances. Here's someone who wasn't given any leeway. This is from Monday the 16th of April. At Tower Bridge Police Court on Saturday, Francis Joseph McCarthy, 20, described as a civil servant of Jamaica Road, Bermondsey, was charged before Mr. Waddy with having in his possession a revolver without a firearms certificate. The prisoner pleaded guilty and said he regarded the weapon as a toy. Some toy. The magistrate, in fining the prisoner 20 shillings, said that lots of young and foolish people belonged to leagues who did not mean to do any harm. I should explain that there was some evidence that he was involved in Irish Republican organisations, which I would have thought would put a rather different spin on things. Now, 20 shillings is £1, which is a fifth of an ounce of gold, so you can do the conversion. Well, at the moment, that would be about £300. Not a particularly heavy fine. And, I haven't applied the Crozier fudge factor, which says that the pound is overvalued by a factor of about 2, so it comes down to about £150 in today's money, which really isn't a lot at all. It should be pointed out that today this man will be going to jail for that offence, and it should also be pointed out that in the 1920s the murder rate was perhaps half what it is today. Guns may not have been banned, but not so much theatres. This is from Wednesday the 18th of April. The efforts of Mr. J.B. Fagan to found in Oxford a permanent theatre have received a check owing to the action of the Vice-Chancellor. Vice-Chancellor? That's a university post, is it not? Owing to the action of the Vice-Chancellor, Dr. Farnell, in placing out of bounds a new theatre called the Playhouse, which was to have opened on April the 25th. Placing out of bounds, I can only imagine he means that he has banned undergraduates from going to this theatre, presumably under the threat of being sent down or being sent away from the university. It goes on. The day after the dramatic licence for the theatre had been granted by the civic authorities, Mr. Fagan applied to the Vice-Chancellor for the necessary licence for the plays. Right, okay. So the Vice-Chancellor, not the civic authorities, has the power to license the plays. By the way, in those days, and I think it was true up until the late 1960s, that a play had to have approval. In London, I think it was the Lord Chamberlain, whoever he might be, had to give approval. Anyway, it goes on. Dr. Farnell replied, saying that no one could sympathise more than himself with the view that there should be in Oxford opportunities for really first-class drama. He said that as a magistrate, he should be consulted regarding the initial licensing of a new theatre, and he would also have to pass and approve of every play acted there. Okay, is it because he's a magistrate that he has to approve the plays, or is it because he's Vice-Chancellor? Or is he using those words interchangeably? I suppose all this just does suggest that the law could be very funny 100 years ago, or funny by our standards. Anyway, it goes on. If another theatre was started for the production of first-class plays, the plays at the existing new theatre would probably degenerate, and if licence were given to a new theatre, it would be difficult to prevent others springing up. Well, it sounds as if it would be all too easy. So who knows what he's complaining about? Further down the article came this. Term time, especially in the summer term, had become so filled with entertainments that sober people sometimes wondered if Oxford was a working university at all. No comment. It goes on. If a new theatre was to be allowed, it could only be after very careful and serious consultation among the authorities of the university, both present and future. Further on we get this. In a further letter accepting Dr. Farnell's decision, Mr. Fagan said, I always understood that the licensing of a theatre was a matter of the town authorities, and that the Act of Queen Victoria gave the Vice-Chancellor discretionary power in the licensing of plays, a discretion which he is bound to exercise. Dr. Farnell has also objected to the Rag Regatta, which it was proposed to hold at the end of the summer term in aid of the Radcliffe Infirmary. Sounds like a bundle of fun. Well, I say that, but I rather suspect that universities were better in those days, even if they did insist on people doing Latin and Greek. Anyway, that's all for this week. I aim to have something up next week, but I promise nothing.